In the year 1977, a black minister from a quiet town in Arkansas mysteriously disappeared, leaving behind only unanswered questions and rumors within the religious community. For decades, his fate remained a mystery, until 25 years later, when a logger working in a remote forested area made a chilling discovery beneath a long-forgotten tree stump, a hidden truth never meant to surface. Marcus Freeman, now 42 years old, sat alone in his modest apartment early on a Friday morning, situated in a small town near the Ozark Mountains in Arkansas. The low murmur of the television filled the stillness of the room. With a weary breath, he picked up the remote and started browsing through the channels, a parade of faces flashing across the screen. It was still early, before regular programming had begun. He paused on one station where a religious broadcast was airing, a preacher delivering an impassioned sermon. Behind him, the gentle light from stained glass windows shimmered, and hymns played softly in the background. Marcus stopped to watch. The preacher's fervent voice echoed memories of his father, Reverend Elijah Freeman, who once delivered similar messages from the pulpit. A deep, painful tightness formed in Marcus's chest. It had been 25 years since his father's sudden disappearance, an absence that had eroded both his faith and his optimism. He turned away from the screen, unable to continue watching the prayers and sermons that used to bring him peace. Suddenly, the phone rang, shattering the silence. Marcus walked to the kitchen and picked up the receiver, startled to hear a voice he hadn't heard in decades. "Mr. Freeman, this is Detective Sarah Miller. I'm calling regarding your father's case. We've made a discovery." Marcus's brow furrowed and he tightened his grip on the phone. "Is this some kind of cruel prank? That case is ancient history." "I understand your doubt, Mr. Freeman," the detective said calmly, "but I assure you this is real. Just this morning, a logger in the forest uncovered an old Adidas duffel bag. Inside were a minister's robe and a Bible with your father's name on it." Marcus's heart missed a beat. After so many years, evidence? "A Bible with my father's name?" "Yes, sir. We'd like you to come out and verify the items. Officers are already on their way to pick you up, if that's acceptable." "Of course," Marcus responded, his pulse quickening. "I'll be ready." After ending the call, he hurried to change into suitable clothes, his mind swirling with thoughts and questions. As he passed the living room, he glanced at the religious program still playing on the TV and felt a sharp pang of remorse for the bitterness he'd felt earlier. There was a time, back when his father was still alive, when his faith had been unwavering. But after the disappearance, he had lost all belief. When the police arrived, he switched off the television, opened the door, and accompanied the officers to their vehicle. The ride out of town was quiet for the most part, taking roughly 15 minutes from the small community where he lived. As they traveled farther into the dense woods, Marcus couldn't help but question just how remote and secluded their destination truly was, and how such a bag could have ended up this far removed from any populated area. When they finally arrived at the site, Marcus observed a crowd of officers and workers already gathered. Bright yellow tape had been strung around the perimeter to restrict access, while police personnel snapped photos of the tree stump and the dirt surrounding it. Detective Sarah Miller greeted Marcus as he drew near. She appeared to be in her early 50s, with piercing eyes and a composed, no-nonsense attitude. "Mr. Freeman, I appreciate you coming. This is Tom Jenkins, the logger who came across the bag." Tom, a broad-shouldered man with a rugged face, stepped up and extended his hand. "Morning. Sorry we're meeting like this." Marcus took his hand and gave it a shake. "Can you tell me how you found it?" Tom nodded, pointing toward the large stump nearby. "My co-worker and I were clearing this patch of forest when I noticed something odd about that tree base. I started digging at it with a shovel. Can't get heavy equipment back here, it's too remote, and eventually uncovered this old Adidas bag buried underneath. Once I looked inside and saw the Bible and robe, I realized this wasn't something that belonged out here. That's when I called it in." Marcus stepped closer to the bag, now lying to the side where the police had placed it. He stared first at the stump, trying to comprehend what he was looking at. How in the world had this bag ended up buried beneath a tree stump? Tom rubbed his beard thoughtfully. From what I can gather, someone chopped down the tree a long time ago, dug a pit underneath the stump, and stashed the bag there before covering it up. Look here, he said, pointing at the base. This stump's rotted through, which made it easier to dig underneath. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. Detective Miller turned to the officers. Let's examine the bag and its contents. Mr. Freeman, we'll need your help verifying these items. They walked over to a small canopy that had been erected nearby. Marcus followed them into the tent, where the bag had been placed carefully atop a folding table. Officers slipped on latex gloves before unzipping it. The first item they pulled out was the Bible. Though the pages were mostly stuck together from moisture, the condition was surprisingly preserved thanks to the bag's protection. Portions of the text were still legible. On the inside cover, in the upper corner of the first page, Marcus immediately spotted his father's name written in the handwriting he had known since he was a child. That's definitely my father's writing, Marcus murmured. One of the officers slowly turned to the final page, where a folded note had been placed inside. It seemed like a prayer entry. But as Marcus began reading, it became clear this wasn't just a routine spiritual note. The words read more like a desperate plea, a cry to God to end suffering, to understand the existence of evil, and a request for strength to resist those trying to pull the writer away from his faith. Marcus swallowed hard. That's my father's handwriting, no doubt. It's unmistakable, deep, deliberate. I remember it clearly from all the times he taught me scripture in his study. The next item they examined was the robe. Detective Miller lifted it with care. We're confident it's been buried since 1977, she explained. Now that we have it, we can conduct DNA analysis. But since we're in a small rural town, we'll have to send everything to a state or federal lab. We don't have the necessary facilities locally. Marcus leaned in to touch the robe, his fingers gently tracing the material, absorbing the gravity of what lay before him. I'm pretty sure this belonged to my father. The size matches, Marcus said, examining the robe closely. Then he looked up at Detective Miller. I agree. The DNA testing sounds like a good step. A disturbing thought crept into his mind. Do you think someone might have done something to my dad? That he was murdered? Detective Miller studied the robe again with care. There are no visible signs of blood. If someone had harmed your father and tried to hide these items, we'd normally expect some trace of violence, something that indicates foul play. But historically, none of the evidence we reviewed ever pointed toward a homicide. She gave Marcus a look of gentle concern. It's possible your father was going through something internal. Maybe he was burdened and decided to vanish, abandoning his pastoral life and identity, symbolically burying it out here in the forest. Marcus shook his head with conviction. No, my father wasn't a man who ran away. He wouldn't have just disappeared. And if he really intended to escape or take his own life, why come all the way out here into the middle of nowhere just to bury a bag? His gaze dropped to the old Adidas duffel. And I've never seen this bag before. He wasn't the type to own something like this. He lived simply. This doesn't fit. Tom Jenkins gave a nod of agreement. Digging a hole deep enough to hide a bag like that, especially under a tree stump this size? That's not easy work. Even in its decayed state, you can see how thick those roots are. It would have taken someone working solo a long time and a lot of effort. To get that done, Detective Miller nodded thoughtfully. We'll take all of this into account. Were there any individuals, either from town or the church, who had issues with your father? Marcus let out a heavy sigh. Well, this is the Ozarks. Back then, race relations were tense, especially in small religious communities like ours. My father stayed true to his calling, though. He was a devoted pastor. He wouldn't have intentionally harmed anyone. The detective gave a quiet nod. We'll re-examine the old files and revisit the original evidence. For now, we're not ruling anything out. As officers secured the newly discovered evidence, Marcus asked whether they could send him photos of everything they'd uncovered. One of them assured him that after processing was complete, they would provide him with documentation and photographic records. Detective Miller gave Marcus the all-clear to head home. She then turned her attention to Tom Jenkins, speaking with him about the new restrictions that would be placed on the area now that it was an active investigation site. A police officer walked Marcus back to the car, and soon they were on the road, heading back to town. Once they arrived and Marcus was dropped off, instead of going straight inside, he made his way toward the room in his apartment that housed his father's old study. The modest home he'd grown up in had been sold long ago, but Marcus had kept many of his father's most cherished possessions, especially everything from the study. He'd carefully recreated it in a spare room. He started by scanning the shelves, searching specifically for his father's sermon manuscripts. With care, he began gathering them. His father had always been meticulous, each notebook organized and stored with intention. Though time had turned many of the pages yellow and dust had settled over them, the collection remained impressively intact. Marcus reflected on how young he had been the first time he really dove into those teachings. Just 15, studying under his father's guidance. Now at 42, only fragments of those lessons remained clear in his mind. He wanted to read through them again, not just to remember his father's words, but to reassure himself, to believe without doubt that his father had been a devout man, not someone who had abandoned his faith or taken his own life. Deep down, Marcus was convinced something else had happened. As he continued pulling the sermon notebooks off the shelves, he suddenly noticed something strange. The volume from 1977, the year his father vanished, was missing. He began searching. He searched thoroughly, every room, even inside his father's old bedroom, but still couldn't find what he was looking for. Instead, tucked away in a cabinet near the bed, Marcus came across another set of his father's private journals, but just like the sermon notes, these only went up to the years before 1977. Marcus sank down onto the edge of the bed, deep in thought. If my father had always been so meticulous about keeping records, why are the 1977 sermons and journal missing? Why aren't they stored here at home like everything else? He wondered. Then it occurred to him, maybe those particular documents had been kept at the church, where his father had worked full-time during that year. His mind drifted back to the day he had packed up and moved his father's belongings from the family house. He'd been so overwhelmed by grief and confusion that he hadn't really checked the materials or noted what was missing. Marcus straightened up, cleaned up the study space a bit, and chose one of the older sermon notebooks to take along for reference. Then he grabbed his keys and left for the car. He was on his way to Mount Olive Missionary Baptist Church, a place he hadn't set foot in for a quarter of a century. As he drove, memories began to stir. He could still hear his father's voice, echoing from the pulpit, strong, heartfelt, full of conviction. The church had once come alive through those sermons, warmed by Elijah Freeman's passion and unwavering faith. That recollection hurt, but this time Marcus didn't fight it off. He let the emotion wash through him. He wanted to remember the man who raised him, steadfast, morally grounded, and dedicated to his ministry. The drive to Mount Olive didn't take long, just around 10 minutes. When he arrived, the building looked noticeably older than it had in his memories. At 17 years old, he'd remembered the church as fresh and majestic. Now age had weathered its facade. He paused outside, taking a long breath. Never had he imagined returning to a church, let alone this one, after all these years. With a bit of hesitation, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. Surprisingly, little had changed. The wooden pews still shone from regular polishing. Stained glass windows, spilled colored light across the floor. The pulpit still stood proudly at the front, stately and commanding. Marcus walked further in, noticing an elderly man near the altar. As Marcus approached, the man turned with a warm smile. "Can I help you, son?" "I hope so," Marcus responded. "I'm looking for someone who might have known my father." The older man introduced himself modestly as Pastor Harold Whitmore and asked what had brought Marcus there. The name immediately clicked in Marcus's memory. He had seen this man many times during his youth 25 years ago. Though visibly older now, Marcus clearly recognized him. Pastor Harold had been the head pastor, the one who had worked alongside his father. Marcus extended his hand and introduced himself. "I'm Marcus Freeman, son of Reverend Elijah Freeman." At first, Pastor Harold appeared stunned, unable to connect the adult man before him with the boy he had once known. Then, recognition lit up his face, and his expression softened into delight. "Marcus, my goodness, can it really be you? We haven't seen you since..." His voice drifted off. "Since my father went missing," Marcus finished for him. "It's been 25 years." Pastor Harold nodded with a solemn expression. "How have you been holding up these days?" "We've really missed seeing you around," he said kindly. Marcus gave a quiet, honest reply. "That event truly shook my faith. Even today, I struggle to fully believe in God." Pastor Harold nodded again, this time with deep understanding in his eyes. Just then, the sound of the rear door opening drew their attention. An older gentleman entered the sanctuary. Pastor Harold raised his voice slightly, calling out, "Reverend George Langston, look who's come to visit." Reverend George, another longtime servant of the church, made his way over. Both men looked pleasantly surprised and warmly greeted Marcus. Curious, they asked him what had prompted his return after so many years away. Marcus began explaining what had happened in the secluded woods, the discovery of a buried item, and how law enforcement now suspected his father may have either ended his life or intentionally abandoned his pastoral duties. "I'm here searching for some clarity," Marcus admitted. "Do you believe my father could have really taken his own life or walked away from his ministry? You both worked closely with him." The two men were silent at first, exchanging uneasy glances. "Your father was always seen as a kind-hearted soul," Pastor Harold finally said. "He was devoted to his calling, wise and courageous," he continued. "But the truth is," Reverend George said softly, "no one can ever fully understand what lies in another man's heart." "What's made you start asking these questions now?" Pastor Harold asked gently. Marcus explained that the authorities had reopened the case due to the new discovery. If they managed to locate his remains, they might be able to determine what really happened to him. His voice caught slightly, in his throat. "Modern forensics and DNA analysis have advanced so much since back then." Harold and George again exchanged a loaded look. "We never once thought of your father as someone burdened by inner torment," Harold said slowly. "But in the final days before his disappearance," he added, "we did notice him staying late in his church office, often in deep, anguished prayer. And whenever someone asked about it," Reverend George chimed in, "he'd say it was all part of intense spiritual devotion." Marcus nodded solemnly, then shared the real purpose behind his visit. "I'm trying to find the missing sermon notebook from 1977 and also his personal diary from that same year. I brought along an earlier volume to show you what it should look like." He took out an older notebook he had brought from home. "My dad used this same style of journal consistently up through 1977. But the book from that specific year is gone. The diary for that year is missing too, though I have every other one." Harold and George took turns inspecting the notebook Marcus presented. "We don't recall ever seeing these," Harold admitted. "If we had, we would have turned them over to you, or to the authorities, back then." "Well, let's take a look anyway," George suggested. The three of them made their way to the church office, which used to be Reverend Elijah Freeman's workspace, but was now used by George. They began checking through the bookshelves and filing cabinets, hoping for a lead, but nothing turned up. Deciding to search further, they headed to the church library, combing through shelves, drawers, and boxes. The search dragged on for nearly an hour. As they searched, Marcus placed his reference notebook down on a table in the library, keeping his attention on the task. But after all their effort, there was no sign of the missing sermon volume or diary. Eventually, Marcus turned to the two men. "Thank you both," he said sincerely. "Sorry if I troubled you. I really do appreciate your help, even though we didn't find what I hoped for." Before heading out, Marcus took a moment to kneel at one of the pews. He bowed his head and prayed, feeling